So as I'm sure many of you already know, Sonic has a lot of games. Like, a lot of games. I really wanted to cover it for the Biggest Flaw and Strength series anyway though, because I love challenging myself with these videos, and the original plan was to do every mainline Sonic game, but I didn't want to even begin to deal with the philosophical debate of what actually counts as a mainline. So instead, we're just gonna do all of the 2D games in this video, and eventually I'll probably get around to giving the same treatment to the 3D Sonic games. As is the case with these videos, we will be doing the biggest strength of every 2D Sonic game next, so make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for that. Also, today we are being joined by SF Productions to help really determine what the biggest flaw of these games are. So with all of that being said, let's get started with the Genesis games. Sonic the Hedgehog 1 on a Genesis is quite the flawed game, despite how iconic and important it was. I mean, right away there are a few ways in which the game is dated compared to its successors. For example, zones are 3 acts long and you don't yet have your spin dash. However, what has to be the biggest thing that halts me from fully enjoying this game has gotta be the pacing. The game kicks off with Green Hill Zone, a brilliant opener that melds together the sense of speed, exploration, and non-linearity that makes Sonic such a unique 2D platformer. So it is rather obnoxious when immediately after you get thrown into Marble Zone, which is a slow, and I mean slow, pace level that constantly has you waiting for things that allow you to proceed in tedium. Just a few stages later is Labyrinth Zone, one of the most agonizing 2D Sonic levels with the underwater controls feeling like trudging through molasses. It's just one of those things that for my taste separates this from many of the other Sonic games, and not really for good reason.
Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is up next, and I gotta say, as much as I love some of the future entries, Sonic 2 might be my favorite out of the original 2D classic Sonic games. It introduced so much to the series: the spin dash, tails, iconic zones like Casino Night. There's a lot to love here, so it was kind of hard finding the biggest flaw of this game. But I think I got it. The special stages. I know what you might be thinking. The half-pipe special stages are iconic. There have been multiple iterations of them throughout the series, which is true, but Sonic 2's special stages are by far the worst iteration. And I need to make it clear that I'm talking about the original game special stages. If you play Sonic 2 on Origins or the 2013 mobile remake, the special stages will look something like this. Doesn't look too bad, but if you play them on the original version, they look like this. Yeah. Pretty bad. The lower frame rate makes it very difficult to read what's ahead of you. Tails also likes to fuck you over because if he gets hit, you lose rings. So not only do you have to keep up with Sonic's position, but you also have to be aware of what Tails is doing, along with the shitty frame rate disorienting you. That combined with the awkward control scheme and weird physics makes it a very poor experience. Sonic CD has always been such a strange game to me. I don't think the game is bad by any means. There are multiple aspects of it that I do like, but the overall experience has always left a mixed impression for me. But when it comes to this game's biggest flaw, well, there's a lot we can go with. The first thought I had was the game's level design. Compared to other 2D classic Sonic games, CD's level design is a lot more open and exploration focused, often limiting your speed and freedom compared to games like Sonic 2. But honestly, I don't mind CD's level design that much. In fact, I think it enhances the game in some cases. So what I ultimately went with are the boss fights. CD's boss fights are some of the easiest, and I don't want to say lazy, but it kind of feels that way sometimes. Not all of the fights are bad. Collision Chaos's fight has always been a bit challenging for me, but that's kind of it. Most of the bosses in this game are easily beatable in maybe 30 seconds tops. Now, I understand that the boss fights in the Genesis games have never been much to write home about. They've always been super easy for the most part, but CDs have always been the easiest, to an almost annoying degree.
Non-controversial opinion incoming, Sonic 3 and Knuckles is a pretty damn good video game. It is my, and many others, favorite among the classic 2D Sonic titles, however that doesn't mean it is without its faults. For my taste, while I like most of the zones in this game, it includes an unsavory 1-2 punch early on with Marble Garden and Carnival Night Zone. For the former, you have to deal with loads of spiked balls that appear out of nowhere with no way for the player to expect them coming, awkward slopes, and the horrendous spinning drill that to this day I can't for the life of me figure out how to control. Similarly is Carnival Night Zone, with an equally goofy gimmick being the red barrels. Most of the level has you avoiding them, however, then there is the infamous red barrel that caused many people, quite reasonably, to not know how to proceed since the game never properly teaches it to you. Also, the little orbs that bounce you around are absolutely horrific to deal with, especially on Act 2. Once you do get through these two zones, it does generally get back on track, maybe with the exception of Sandopolis zone a bit later in the game, but like damn, this is a roadblock in an otherwise fantastic game. Now, when I said we are talking about every 2D Sonic, I meant it. Enter the Game Gear Sonic titles. Technically, these are also released on the Master System, and many possibly prefer those versions, I don't know, but I played the Game Gear iteration since they're widely more accessible in the modern day, so that's what we're going to be focusing on. So anyway, the first Sonic game to talk about during this section is, well, Sonic the Hedgehog. Roughly half a year after the original Sonic game, we got an 8-bit counterpart, which is mostly its own game. You got a few zone themes returning, such as Green Hill, Scrap Brain, and Labyrinth. Yup, despite for the most part this being kind of an unnotable entry among the Game Gear titles, I have to pick Labyrinth as the biggest flaw, as it is even worse than the Genesis version. Controlling this game already feels pretty slow in the first place, but oh my god, it is just unbearable in this zone. Also, the platforming is really dull and boring. Not that the Genesis version of Labyrinth was good, but I mean, it was better, I guess. I don't know, Labyrinth Zone just sucks all around the board. There is also an auto-scroller in this game via Bridge Zone Act 2, which, yeah, that sucks as well. But that is just one act versus the whole zone that is Labyrinth. Alright, now moving on to Sonic 2 for the Game Gear, and I really need to emphasize the Game Gear version for this one because oh my god, the fucking screen crunch. The original plan was to go with the boss fights for this game because I hated every second of fighting them, but then I looked up footage of the Master System version and realized most of my resentment came from not being able to see anything. Like, when playing the Game Gear version, the first boss fight you encounter is unironically one of the hardest Sonic fights I have ever dealt with. And not because of good boss design, but because you can't properly react to the projectiles that you need to dodge. This problem extends well beyond the bosses though. The levels themselves are littered from top to bottom with moments of just crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. In this game, they were also really horny for putting spikes everywhere, which definitely doesn't help with the already problematic screen crunch. It kinda sucks because after researching, it seems that those who played the Master System version enjoyed it much more because this whole problem is kinda rectified there.
Now we have Sonic Chaos for the Sega Master System and the Sega Game Gear. This might be a bit of a hot take, but I've always really liked this game. Is it as good as Sonic 2, 3, CD, or even 1? No, obviously not. Chaos is possibly one of the most bare-bones classic Sonic experiences you can get, but I always thought this game was fairly fun to get through. The game is not without its flaws, however. It's just too damn easy, man. We already talked a bit about the screen crunch, and while that does present a tiny bit of challenge, most of the challenge this game offers involves you working around the jank and technical setbacks presented by the hardware the game is running on. It's not a result of the actual game design, and again, most of that is exclusive to one version of the game anyway. When it comes to the actual level design and bosses, the game is too simplistic. Sonic Triple Trouble is another game that I think is super underrated. It's basically just Sonic Chaos but better. The level design is much more interesting and intricately designed, the game introduces new characters like Fang, and the bosses are pretty decent too. But there's one tiny problem. This game, unlike Sonic Chaos, is exclusive to the Sega Game Gear, meaning that it also has all of the technical issues with the screen crunch and slowdown, and if you ask me, it really brings the game down a notch. The screen crunch is one thing. You can kinda get used to it throughout your playthrough and learn how to work around it, but with the slowdown, it's just too distracting, and it's a hindrance in many instances, especially those that involve strict platforming. And it's a shame because, again, I really like Triple Trouble. I would easily be able to put this game among some of my favorite 2D Sonic games, because what's here underneath all of the jank and hardware issues is really well designed and fun. But sadly, Triple Trouble has forever been stuck on a console that has always held it back from reaching its fullest potential.
Next up is Sonic Blast. I mean, take your pick. I'm sure if you ask 100 people who have played this game what the worst part of it is, you'd get a wide variety of answers. You got Blue Marine Zone being fucking awful, a really bad screen screen crunch problem akin to Sonic 2 8-bit, the controls are incredibly sluggy and heavy feeling. At the end of the day though, while it's impressive that a Game Gear game was able to run these pre-rendered sprites, it looks pretty bad and causes said screen crunch issues to be worse. So for starters, whether you are playing as Sonic or Knuckles, they are way too big. This causes the screen to feel super zoomed in and you not being able to react to levels properly. That is the main reason though why I didn't specifically choose screen crunch for this game, because yeah, it's a problem, but it feels like it's more so caused by a larger issue. Alongside that, the models just look awkward and clunky in the first place. I probably could have just as easily picked Blue Marine Zone because it is alongside Labyrinth as a miserable water stage, but the aesthetic and visuals feel like more of a holistic issue that plagues the game as a whole.
Sonic Pocket Adventure is yet another very underrated and even obscure Sonic game. Not many people know about this one's existence, primarily due to it being an exclusive to the Neo Geo Pocket Color, a console that not many people know about. And that's a shame because I think Pocket Adventure is a really good game. Not a 10 out of 10 like IGN gave it, but it's still really fun. But unfortunately, there's one thing that holds this game down a lot, and that is the reused zone themes. I know this wouldn't be the only Sonic game that reuses zone themes, but unlike games like Mania and Generations, Pocket Adventure doesn't do much to make these zones stand out from their original counterparts. Most of the time, Pocket Adventure kinda just feels like a very watered down version of Sonic 2. A handful of the zones are taken from that game, a majority of the bosses are similar to those seen in Sonic 2 and Sonic 3, hell, even the special stages are exactly like the ones seen in Sonic 2. So despite Pocket Adventure having pretty fun gameplay and pretty solid level design as well, it ultimately lacks an identity due to just how much it reuses from previous games, which in my opinion ultimately contributed to Pocket Adventure fading into obscurity.
Finally, now we have gotten through the Game Gear segment and it's time for our next section of the video, the advanced games. Here we got a trilogy of games to go through, each being some of the easiest in this entire video to decide what the biggest flaw was, at least in my case. Sonic Advance 1 is my personal favorite out of these three, however there is one thing that is impressively bad in this game. The special stages are just straight up hilarious. Essentially, you can enter these stages by jumping on these springs and levels, which in the special stage you have to collect rings in this incredibly awkward and disorienting perspective. It makes it so going for the Chaos Emeralds is rather annoying because trying to collect the rings is straight up painful. And I mean painful literally, by the way, my eyes hurt playing these special stages. It's not just an eyesore though, the depth perception is straight up nonsensical. Other than this, I personally enjoy Sonic Advance 1, even despite some of the other issues like beginner traps and whatnot. But yeah, fun game, special stages suck ass though. Sonic Advance 2 is the outlier out of the advanced games because really it was between two issues, the tedium that comes from trying to 100% the game and the boost mechanic. Now while the boosting can certainly lead to moments where you can't properly react to stage elements, I can't in good faith ignore just how often it is that soaring through levels is a blast. It's just a mechanic that I found to be more interesting in future games like Sonic Rush. The problem I really have with Advance 2 is the process of 100%ing the game though. Here you need to find 7 rings in each level as every single character. To me, this is probably the worst game for this kind of requirement to be set in place, because the levels were designed around you just soaring through them at blistering speeds with many points where backtracking isn't accounted for. So not only is it just in concept obnoxious to have to replay levels this much for the rings, but actually getting them is obnoxious. Of course you don't have to do all that to simply play the game, but if you want to play as Amy Rose, then buckle up. Now as for Sonic Advance 3, this game has a hub area that connects the levels and I for one am not really a fan of this. It feels kind of clunky to go through to each of the levels, but more so for my taste, it kind of feels like a pace breaker in between levels. This just isn't the kind of thing I personally am looking for with a 2D Sonic game. I was also kind of weighing between this and the constant bottomless pits and spikes that are laid everywhere across the levels, but that's more of a problem with the advanced games just in general. Like all three of these games are plagued by beginner traps, so the hub area felt like the next logical pick in my opinion.
Alright, now we're moving into the DS era of Sonic games, starting with Sonic Rush. I absolutely love this game. To this day, Rush is one of my favorite 2D Sonic games. The boost gameplay is so exhilarating. It's an absolute blast just boosting through a ton of enemies and reaching the speeds you can reach with the mechanic. But the game kind of falls apart when you get to the actual platforming. This game's level design maintains a lot of the issues that are found throughout the advanced games, and in some cases, it's kind of worse. You got things like bottomless pits, poor enemy placement, stage gimmicks that break the flow, enemy rooms. Like, they just went all out with the bullshit in this game. Over time, I've learned to kind of tolerate the jank in Sonic Rush, and again, I still think the game is a load of fun. The gameplay easily outweighs the bad level design for me. But man, the game would be so much better without all of the crap that's shoved into these levels. Speaking of random bullshit, Sonic Rush Adventure. I also really love this game. It makes a ton of improvements to the level design. The levels in Rush Adventure are actually really well designed and even include some interesting stage mechanics. But the problem with Rush Adventure is that the core levels are really only 50% of the game. The other 50% involves you using the different water vehicles you unlock throughout the game to travel to said levels. Rush Adventure is infamously known for having so much filler. You have a central hub world, and every time you want to travel to a new level, you have to go and board whatever vehicle can travel the distance you want to travel. You have to strategically draw the path you want to travel on the touchscreen, because if you run into some rocks, you're fucked, and you have to restart from the beginning. And that's not even mentioning how tedious the water travel minigames can get, specifically the ones with the sailboat. And sometimes you can get right up on an island, but the game will tell you that you're not close enough, so you have to restart all the way from the beginning. You have to deal with this every time you want to play any new level in the game. And that includes the multiple hidden islands that you'll sometimes need to travel to collect the materials you need to build new vehicles that you then use to travel longer distances. It's just too much. I don't even hate the idea of having smaller mini games like this between levels, and some of them, like the water bike and the hovercraft, are really fun, but it just gets annoying after a while. You could run through Rush Adventure in maybe 5 hours, but most of that time will be spent on these vehicles. There's just too much filler, and it's a shame because in concept, it contributes to the overall world building of Rush Adventure, which is something that Rush 1 kind of lacked, but in execution, it just keeps you away from the actual great level design that Rush Adventure offers.
Sonic Colors is one of those cases where we got a demake of a console Sonic game, of course in this case being Sonic Colors for the DS. In terms of all of these that I have played, which is essentially the 2D ones, this is pretty easily my favorite. It is very similar to the Sonic Rush games, even being in the same engine, however that isn't to say that it's the exact same, as now we got Wisp in this game. These are sort of like little power-ups found throughout each zone, and this is where we have the biggest flaw of this specific game, the Burst Wisp. This is found in Sweet Mountain, with its concept enabling you to shoot directionally in the air. The problem is how finicky the controls for it are. It is very easy to mess up where you're trying to shoot, which can get pretty annoying quickly. It's just not fun to try to deal with, and it's definitely the biggest stain on an otherwise pretty quality 2D Sonic title. Now it is time to get to the game that I've been dreading talking about this entire video, Sonic the Hedgehog 4 Episode 1. I had never played this up until the making of these videos, and I was pretty scared going in, just based off of all the passing opinions I've heard over the years that are not particularly savory. I tried my best to go in with an open mind anyway, but I mean, where do I even start? The stages are littered with some of the most atrocious gimmicks I've ever encountered in a series. I mean, I thought Sonic 3's drill and Sonic 2 8-Bit's hang glider were clunky to control, and then I encountered stuff like the spinning ball things on Lost Labyrinth. Like, what the fuck is this shit? And speaking of the zones, they feel really uninspired just in general, leading to a lack of identity within the game. And yet, at the end of the day, the biggest problem has to be the physics and movement. The clean physics that made the levels so fun in the Genesis games and Sonic Advance 1 are just nowhere to be found here, making the game feel really awkward and unintuitive. Things like half pipes and building up speed is so stiff feeling in this game, which feels particularly bad since it calls itself the 4th game in the classic series. I don't really like relentlessly beating down on games like this, it's just I don't have very many nice things to say about Sonic 4 Episode 1.
Sonic 4 Episode 2, thankfully, makes plenty of improvements to the formula that was introduced in Episode 1. The level design is much better, the environments are much more interesting and original, the gameplay has been touched up and includes some new mechanics, the visuals actually look pretty decent, and the music, while still not being great, is much better. But there's one aspect of this game that unfortunately didn't get the facelift it desperately needed, and that is the boss fights. Now, to give them some credit, the boss fights in 4 Episode 2 are much more interesting than Episode 1's, with their varying designs and attack patterns, but they all share one thing in common. They're very slow and just kind of a slog to get through. Some of them have far too many hit points, and their attack patterns are often very predictable and don't evolve much over the duration of the fights. I don't think it's really a huge deal, as up until recently, the boss fights were never anything that crazy when it comes to Sonic games. But with 4 Episode 2, they're definitely one of the weakest aspects.
Sonic Generations was one of the console entries that had a handheld iteration, this time being released on the 3DS. However, in this case it was unfortunately inferior to its console counterpart in virtually any meaningful metric. The biggest problem at the end of the day comes from both classic and modern Sonic playing in 2D on the 3DS, leading to it not having the same juxtaposition that was provided on the console version. There, you had two incredibly distinct styles that were a lot of fun to play through. Here though, you got classic Sonic, which while not being as disastrous as Sonic 4, still feels a bit stiff and unexciting, and then modern Sonic, which plays more in lines of the boost style of Sonic Rush. Neither of these styles here in Generations 3DS feel particularly fun or memorable, causing the overall package to bleed together more. I definitely would not have expected a 3DS port of a console version to maintain the same quality, but what I brought up is the biggest and most relevant reason as to why I vastly prefer the original Generations console release.
Jesus Christ, okay. Sonic Boom Shattered Crystal is up next, and yeah, this game is really bad. There's just a lot of things about it that I flat out don't like. When it comes to its biggest flaw, my mind almost immediately went to the submarine levels. These are fucking horrendous to play, but at the end of the day, these levels are just kind of a side thing. I can't be too harsh on them. So what I'm going with here is the level design. Shattered Crystal has some of the most open-ended and exploration-focused level design in the entire series. And that's not a good thing. It's almost Metroidvania-like in a sense. A majority of these levels have several branching pathways in different areas to explore. But the problem is that Shattered Crystal isn't designed like a Metroidvania. The game is split into multiple separate levels, like a traditional 2D platformer. But since the levels are so open-ended, they take forever to get through. I'm not even kidding. Some of these levels might genuinely take upwards of 10 minutes to complete. That's ridiculous. I think Sonic Boom as a series had plenty of potential, and there are things that I like about Shattered Crystal, but the core level design here just does not mesh well with any of the gameplay styles presented. It's a shame, really. But they kind of brought it back with Fire and Ice. This game was born due to the backlash that Shattered Crystal received, and I'll be damned, there's really nothing about this game that holds it down that much. So many improvements were made to not only the level design, but also how the characters handle and how you approach the gameplay in general. Amy is also playable in this game, that's cool, but unfortunately, I just really don't like this game's boss fights. Don't get me wrong, they are a massive improvement over Shattered Crystal's pseudo boss fights that were mostly just playable cutscenes. The bosses in Fire and Ice are actually designed like traditional boss fights this time, and I think overall, they're decently designed. But man, some of them are just so boring, and they take way too long. There were a couple of boss fights in this game that took anywhere from 7 to 10 minutes. It's like they took the issues of Shattered Crystal having really long levels and short boss fights and flipped them for Fire and Ice. I still think Fire and Ice is a really underrated game though, and I'm glad the Sonic Boom series went out with a decently good game.
Sonic Mania is not only my personal favorite Sonic game, but one of my favorite games of all time. If you watch my videos, that may not be a surprise. I use Sonic Mania music in like every single video I make. So with that being said, it was pretty painful and difficult trying to pick a biggest flaw because I like almost everything here. I would say that there isn't a ton of original zones, but nope, that doesn't really bother me. It's sort of like a Sonic Generation situation where it reimagines classic zones, specifically with Act 2 where there typically is some kind of new idea or mechanic to mix it up. Nope, what I personally find to be the biggest flaw of Mania would be Act 1 of Mirage Saloon Zone specifically. This specific act brings the pacing to a screeching halt with you just standing on a plane. Ew. It is an incredibly hyper-specific nitpick that ultimately doesn't really impact my enjoyment of the game that much, but it's Sonic Mania, what can I say? And finally, we got Sonic Superstars, the latest 2D Sonic game at the time of writing, with an attempt to march onward with the classic Sonic formula. It's overall a fun game, but that doesn't mean it's also not flawed in many ways. The most significant thing that we gotta talk about in this video though is the boss fights. I hope you enjoy waiting because that's what's gonna be going on here. Yeah, so part of what makes good Sonic boss fight design, at least in my opinion, is giving the player the ability to skillfully strike the boss at effectively any point, giving them control over the pace of the fight. But you have to be careful because striking too fast could put yourself in more of a vulnerable position to lose your rings. Here in Superstars though, it largely comes down to you having to patiently wait for an opening, which oftentimes feels like it takes way too long to happen. For example, let's take a look at this fight in Speed Jungle Zone. The way you attack it is by getting these metal rod things to strike into its main body, that of course coming after another attack that it does beforehand. It's pretty easy and doesn't feel particularly satisfying once you do hit it either. And then the second part of the fight has you jumping over it as it revolves around this pole and then hitting the blue rocket whenever it shoots the set downward. For how simple and boring a fight like this is, it takes way too long to eventually get through and beat it. Overall, Superstars is an alright game, but that has to be the biggest thing that I personally don't like about it. So that is just our picks for the biggest flaw of every game in the 2D Sonic franchise. But what about you though? Feel free to let us know down in the comments where you agree and disagree. Be sure to check out SF Productions if you enjoyed his segments. He has a lot of fantastic coverage over on his channel for both Sonic and Mario. Once again, the next video will be going over the biggest strength of every 2D Sonic game, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. Thank you so much for watching, hope you have a great rest of your day, and as always, peace out.